requiring services, but we will make up for it by having a kind of an international artist reuse the words of somebody we all admire politically, etc., and this balances out, right? So we have the horrible bureaucracy and we have the kind of soul-stirring political rhetoric, and everything gets balanced out. That's when one thinks in terms of representation. But if one thinks in terms of an epistemological crisis, that cannot be the case. It's not only that it's not the case, it cannot be the case. And that's why I'm pushing towards an epistemological crisis. So an epistemological crisis seems a much more fertile ground from which to think the notions of an emergent field. An epistemological crisis would allow us to think not competing interests, but absent knowledges. It would allow us to posit a proposition that would say that if we were able to find a way to know this, it might allow us to not think that. So the loss or the sacrifice of a way of thinking, as opposed to the cumulative proliferation of modes of operation. So when I first started thinking about these things, I was invited to a Swedish Association of Museum Workers or something like that. And I said, well, it really has, you've been practicing accumulation, more and more and more stuff. So now what we have to do is practice loss, right? Because we don't know and we don't understand and we can't and so on. So we have to practice loss. So they said, okay, so how do we practice loss? Does that mean that we fill 2 suitcases with works of art and put them in the basement, right? So the sort of one of the things that became very clear speaking in these contexts of museum workers, curators, and so on, was that loss was material, right? Smaller building, less works of art, maybe less commissioning, maybe less of the budget to buying stuff and more of the budget to social activity and educating. It was a kind of material sense of loss. And I'm thinking about how can we practice loss at a very different level, at the level of recognition that the terms we have are not up to the task that faces us, and that's simple. For both curating and the curatorial, the notion of an epistemological crisis is paramount, since they are largely fields grounded in a series of work protocols with little cumulative history or a body of stable empirical or theoretical knowledge at their disposal. Thus, the temptation to hurriedly build up a body of named and applicable knowledge that would dignify the field is probably great. But such absences actually allow for a flexibility of operating and for the possibility of considerable invention, be it of archives or subjects or methodologies. There is an ongoing demand for an end product that coheres around an exhibition, around the act of revealing and concretizing, and that belies all the loosening that had gone into its curatorial operations. And this is, it's very important. I'm not yet fully articulate on this. I'm working on it, but this is really important, that things unpack into processes, and we value the processes. No one would not value the processes, but in the end, there is a demand that it cohere into a final product that is legible, right? So all the processes, they might underwrite the process, but they are not part of our experience of anything. Okay, a second urgency, and the one that currently engages me most, has arisen around the shifting understanding of research. So one of the things that I noticed, so I'm academically trained, but I have a whole set of practices, a little bit of curating, a lot of organizing, and all of them are practices. And for years, my way of working was to take a body of theoretical work and then bring it into the world of practice and see what it does. And then over the recent years, I've noticed that I'm actually learning a lot more from practice than I am from theory. And that really the kind of big leaps that I'm noticing around me have come from the reconceptualization of practice in relation to research, investigation, finding out, positioning yourself in the world, and so on and so on. So and that's why I've started this whole project on research, because I think that arts practices, cultural practices, are now redefining research away from the academy. I don't think the academy defines research anymore. And, but not only that, I think they've impacted on the way research is being done in anthropology and sociology, in media studies, across the humanities and social sciences. The way in which fictioning of narrative has been operating in the arts is something that has begun to circulate widely in so many other fields. And so I've sort of understood that we can no longer have a stable notion of research, academic research, and then say, oh, practitioners research, but in a material way or in a different way or whatever. But it's completely flipped over. Research is now being defined by practices. And so I thought this is something that we need to intervene in for many reasons, because within neoliberal kind of logistical management and algorithmic governance, research is totally linear, predictable, and deliverable. Whereas the kind of research that I'm thinking about that's coming from practices cannot fit within those trajectories, right? It's going to redefine the subject. That's what it's going to do. And so the imperative in a culture that is utterly dominated by evaluation. Okay, so we in Britain are more dominated by evaluation than anybody else, but believe me, it's coming, right? I see it everywhere across Western Europe. Visitor numbers, grant amounts, the sort of publications, outcomes, impacts, constantly everywhere, in places that you would never expect, right? Some basement activist kind of cell that is being asked to explain what its impacts are. I mean, it's sort of, we are in assessment, evaluation, and algorithmic governance. And the point of all that is outcomes are predictable. That's how it operates. And so for us to rethink research is to think against the grain of this form of governance. Research is at the heart of so many of our discussions, and most often shaped and distorted to respond to a set of perceived demands, whether contained within the scenarios of R&D or thought of as a preparatory stage in advance of some professed main event, or served up to tortured forms of evaluation. Research is forever instrumentalized as part of the necessary ensemble of producing knowledge that is deemed original, verifiable, reliable, and therefore evaluable, right? So it has to be original, verifiable, reliable, and that leads to evaluable knowledge. In addition, research has also been thought to be a highly academic activity, consulting great tomes of knowledge, burrowing in dusty archives, interviewing certified actors in troped scenarios, devising technical forms of supporting proof to increase the reality factor of claims made, conceptualizing experiments in a laboratory, or relying on expertise from elsewhere to give credibility to a claim.